I have read a lot of books. I have read a lot of books on racial issues. I considered myself relatively informed and relatively educated. It turns out that I am not that informed and not that educated. This book was a revelation to me. I learned things I did not know. I had the bare skeleton of it, but I did not know the details that I have now learned. So you've got plenty of white space at the top. Let me encourage you to write down a phrase. I'm going to use an absolute phrase, and I am very aware that there are plenty of exceptions to this phrase, but I still want you to write down the phrase I want you to write down. White people do not want black people to blank. And I'd leave a blank there. White people do not want black people to blank. And one of the words you could put in that blank is the word vote. White people don't want black people to vote. They also don't want them to be their boss. They also don't want them to be their peer. They also don't want them living in their neighborhoods. They also don't want them coming to their schools. They also don't want them in their universities. And in this book, they don't want a black person to be a president. The fact is that there is a very long history, and this book is all about this history. There is a very long history of what white people do not want black people to do. And now I'm going to be really blunt. One of the reasons they don't want black people to do it is that they don't believe black people are full, true human beings. They are, in the words of the original U.S. Constitution, 3/5 of a person. And this book is all about that. The book is called White Rage, the Unspoken Truth of Our Racial Divide. It is written by Carol Anderson, a professor at Emory University. It is extraordinarily well researched, and it has detail and factual detail and historical detail, one right after the other. She does get into a couple of areas of maybe questioned opinion, but it's not many, and most of it is fully well documented. So at the top of the page, on page 1, I ask, what is the point? And here's my answer from reading this book. White people do not want black advancement. Circle that phrase. It's critical in the book. Black advancement. They do not want black people to rise, to advance, not to their level, and certainly not above their level. When black people advance, it results in rage in white people. That's the premise of the book. White rage comes from black advancement. This must be acknowledged in order to make changes that might make it possible to move forward. My wife asked me a while ago, are you going to be angry presenting this book? Because this book can generate anger. I hope that I don't have any of the white rage that she talks about. But somebody that I sent this handout to sent me a message and basically said, this book makes me hate white people. And this was a white person. And I'm going to read you part of our back and forth because it was really pretty interesting. What I said was, I thought I was pretty educated on the specifics in our history. Reading this book took me into a whole other level of, I had not known that. Last week, after I presented We Keep Us Safe, Reverend Dr. Michael Waters spoke with some Dallas history. He is Black. He held up an actual KKK robe, hood, membership card from Dallas. He told ghastly stories. The fact is, racism runs deep and still runs deep. The politicians really did reflect the wishes of the people. There are going to be horrible quotes in this book from political office holders, but they represented the people that elected them. Reading and presenting all of these books on racial issues has truly been sobering and dispiriting. And those are my current thoughts. And of course, I'm just a white guy who reads about this. Imagine being Black and dealing with the fear and unfairness. And so those are some personal reflections that I had after reading this book and after sharing the handout with someone. On the left, on the front page, why is this book worth our time? Number one, this book provides a history of the strategies and methods used by white people to keep Black people down in their place as white people saw it. Number two, this book provides an overview history of the laws and practices that were used to accomplish this goal. And number three, this book paints a possible future of what could be if needed changes are ever made. Now, I need to give you a warning. You're going to see some quotes and references to President Johnson. That President Johnson is Andrew Johnson from the 19th century, shortly after the Civil War. There is one reference, or maybe a couple, in the book to President Lyndon Johnson. But when you hear me say the word Johnson and it's a bad story, it's about Andrew Johnson, not Lyndon Johnson. So be aware of that as you're listening to this. Now, I've thought about the way to do this, and I think I want you to jump all the way to near the back of the book. And I know these page numbers are hard to read, but I'm on page 8. So turn to page 8. I'll give you a second. On the left side of page 8, these are kind of my summary of the guts of the book. And most of them, except for the last quote, come right out of the book. White rage is not about visible violence, but rather it works its way through the courts, the legislatures, and a range of government bureaucracies. It wreaks havoc subtly, almost imperceptibly, too imperceptibly, certainly for a nation consistently drawn to the spectacular, to what it can see. White rage is not the Klan. White rage doesn't have to wear sheets, burn crosses, take to the streets. Working the halls of power, it can achieve its ends far more effectively, far more destructively. I set out, the author says in this book, to make white rage visible. The trigger, and this may be the key paragraph of the book, the trigger for white rage inevitably is Black advancement. It is not the mere presence of Black people that is the problem. Rather, it is Blackness with ambition, with drive, with purpose, with aspirations, and with demands for full and equal citizenship. It is Blackness that refuses to accept subjugation, to give up. And all the while, white rage manages to maintain not only the upper hand, but also apparently the moral high ground. It makes the argument that the white people keeping black people down were the moral protectors of the moral center of the United States of America. And so that was the plan. Now, after the Civil War, the South especially believed that the proper role of a black person was to do what I'll call menial labor. That was their job. That was their only job. Any black person, this is an example in the book. If a black person on the plantation during the period of enslaved persons had learned how to be a blacksmith, taking care of the blacksmith needs of the plantation, that person could get a job on a plantation doing that kind of work that's no longer a plantation of slaves, but that person, black person, would not have been permitted, absolutely would not have been permitted to go into town and open a blacksmith shop. That would have been black advancement. Now, that's only one illustration of many. Now, the bottom quote on the left is a quote that I chose from the I Have a Dream speech, and it's important in this book, and I'll read it and then explain why. I have a dream that one day down in Alabama, with its vicious racists, with its governor having his lips dripping with the words of interposition and nullification. That's George Wallace, 1963, in Alabama. The words of interposition and nullification. One day, right there in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today. Here's what happened. The federal government, after the Civil War, all the way through the Jim Crow era, through the 60s, and today, would pass a federal law. And the federal law would say you have to educate all children, including black children. You have to let anybody live where they can afford to live, including black people. And the governors of the southern states and the legislatures of the southern states would step up and say, we will interpose ourselves between the federal government and our state. We're not going to let your laws get through. So that's the idea of interposition. They are interposing themselves between the federal government and the practice of their state. Nullification is treating the laws as null and void. So that's the idea behind this attempt to ignore the efforts by the federal government to make things equal and more possible. All right, on the right, a word about the N word. This word appears numerous times in this book, in quotes from Southern leaders and some leaders from Northern states. Let me just say that it is thrown out as everyday racist language from many people who were elected to public office along with everyday people. Back in the late part of the 19th century, all the way through the 20th century. For example, as he welcomed one, the N-word will catch hell state after the next back into the Union, with no mention whatsoever of black voting rights and thus no political protection, he effectively laid the groundwork for mass murder. This is a statement about a leader, an elected official. The Civil Rights Bill, President Andrew Johnson complained, was just the opening salvo in the radical Republicans' efforts to protect, and now the N-word. And so I made a decision a while back that I would no longer say this word. But I want you to know that it lessens a little bit the impact of these statements to not say the word, because they said it and they meant it and it was ugly. And so consequently, I'm not going to say it, but you're going to see a few quotes in the book where the word appears. And I think I got every one of them with the letter N and then a blank. Here are some stories. In 1925, a man, an African-American man, was a medical doctor, a respected medical doctor in the African-American community. He made some money. He was fully educated. And so he bought a house, a nicer house than he could get in the Black community in an all-white neighborhood. His name is Dr. Ossian Sweet, and you can look him up on Wikipedia. But the book tells the story in great detail. And what he did was he moved into the house with his family, and basically he knew the white people in the neighborhood were going to drive him out. And so he gathered a small arsenal, guns and bullets, to protect himself. And one evening, pretty quickly after he moved in, a mob of white people began to arrive at the house with stones, and they began throwing them through the windows. And it wasn't 5 people, it wasn't 10 people, it was a lot of people. And they started throwing stones, throwing more stones, destroying the windows, threatening to kill them, threatening to destroy the house. And standing there watching were law enforcement officers. If you're not aware of this, law enforcement always took the side, practically always, of the racist people. Remember, it was Alabama state troopers who bashed John Lewis in the head under the order of Governor Wallace. And so Dr. Sweet picked up a gun and fired it and wounded one white person and killed one white person. He and his family were all arrested. They were in jail. The first trial ended on a hung jury because the jurors that voted not to condemn were aware that it was trumped up charges. And then they had a second trial, and the famous Clarence Darrow defended Dr. Sweet. And so Dr. Sweet was acquitted. But his family members all died in jail from neglect and illness. He lost his house, and he, in a small Black apartment of some kind that was not much, he put a gun to himself and killed himself. That's a pretty graphic story about one Black man trying to move into a neighborhood where the white people did not want him in Detroit in 1925. Look at the quotes underneath that. Did Negroes have the same right of self-defense as white people? And the prosecutor said no. The killing of that family man, this is the words of the prosecutor, happened because, quote, the Sweets and their friends were uppity. They murdered Briner, that's the white man that was killed, just to impress on the white people that they didn't propose to be driven out. And the prosecutor made the case that all of this was Dr. Sweet's fault for trying to move into a neighborhood he had no business being in. And I read that story and I kind of stepped back and thought about it and realized that every pioneering person, every Black person moving into a white neighborhood, every Black student going into a school, and they talk about the Little Rock Nine in this book and Ruby Bridges in New Orleans, every one of the first of these people, those people had to be incredibly brave, and they paid a price. Throughout parts of the South, look at this on the bottom, this is beyond disgusting, they had spectacle lynchings. Everything you see on these pages in italics is from the book. These gruesome events were standard family entertainment. Severed body parts became souvenirs, and decorations hung proudly in homes. Just astonishing. And then turn to the top of page 9. What happened was, after Brown versus Board of Education, and now the schools had to integrate, this is in the mid to late 1950s, there were movements in states in the South, not that the North was all that much better, but overtly in the South, there were movements to close the public schools. In Georgia, beating back a 1949 challenge from Black parents to equalize the schools, this is before Brown versus Board of Education, Governor Herman Talmadge in Georgia had already proposed a constitutional amendment that would authorize the state legislature to scrap the public school system altogether, circle this phrase, and channel state funds into tuition grants for white students attending private schools. And so we'll shut down the public schools, we'll give money to the white parents, and we'll let them send their children to private schools. And it sort of makes one wonder about the push for private school receiving government funding even today. I'll admit that. All right. And then I just want to say one thing about crack cocaine. There is zero doubt that Black people who used crack cocaine got much harsher prison sentences. This is in the 70s in Los Angeles especially, but it swept the country. Much harsher prison sentences than white people who used powder cocaine. And it's really the same substance. And she does have a section, and this is one of the ones that is in dispute, although there is reason to believe this, that the CIA basically turned a blind eye on purpose to the drug runners who brought the cocaine into the city streets of Los Angeles. I'm not going to go into that. There's a little controversy about it, but there is no controversy that we sentence Black people for crack cocaine far more harshly than white people for powder cocaine. All right, I'm going to keep going on this page for a minute. Recognize this. Black people were at the bottom. And if they were ever no longer at the bottom, then white people would try to get them back to the bottom. So I'm reading a quote, chattel slavery. Chattel slavery means an enslaved person is not a person, but property of the slave owner, which is what the American enslaved system was. Chattel slavery had marked Blacks at the bottom, economically, politically, socially, culturally, physically, and intellectually. The base. If Blacks extricated themselves from the region, as they were clearly doing and without the approval of whites, this is the Great Migration out of the South, then the entire socioeconomic structure of the South, dependent on the support of that base, was in danger of collapsing. White Southerners saw Black advancement and independence as a threat to their culture and their economy. And so here's what was happening. 1920s, a little earlier, Black people began to get on trains and move to the north. That means now the jobs that Black people were doing in the South weren't going to be done by Black people. They were gone. That means that white people would have to do those jobs. And that means they would be looked down on as doing the lowest jobs. And now they were the lowest people. And the South was not going to let a circumstance happen where any white people were at the bottom rung of the hierarchy. And so they actively tried to stop the Great Migration. All right. How deep is racism? In the book, I wrote this: neither war nor threat, the Black people have to stay at the bottom. So even during World War I, when we were in the middle of a war, the Southern government leaders, state government leaders, were more concerned about Black people going to the North than they were about World War I. And in the late 50s, when Sputnik arrived, and if you are not old enough to know about this, every American was scared to death of the Soviet Union and Sputnik. Well, when Sputnik arrived, the Southern leaders were more concerned about keeping the Black people down than they were about the dangers of the Soviet Union and Sputnik. So this book is a reminder of the horrors of slavery. There are terrible stories about that. It is a reminder that white people, especially white people in the South, but really all white people everywhere, did not want a Black person in their midst with any claim of, any hint of equality. And thus, a reminder of the undermining of Reconstruction. Let me pause here a minute. So what happened was, after the Civil War, there was a brief period where Black men, not women, that's another subject, Black men got the vote, got elected to public office. You'll sometimes hear this phrase, the first Black member of blank since Reconstruction. And what happened was Black people did advance, and then there was an enormous kind of tussle about all of this, and President Andrew Johnson basically turned the South back over to the racists. I told you that I discovered my ignorance. I have mentioned at this event, Urban Engagement Book Club, and other events about the speech by Alexander Stephens, the Vice President of the Confederate States of America. The speech is called the Cornerstone Speech. And in it, he says that the natural place of Black people, Negroes, is the word he used, is that of slave, that the white person is superior to the Black person. I did not know, I had just never read it, that after Reconstruction failed, Alexander Stephens was elected again with all of his racism to the US Congress. That was pretty amazing. So, the delegates, I'm reading now on the middle of page 9. The delegates at Louisiana's Constitutional Conference in October 1865, the Civil War is over, were so confident in the president's support and their reclaimed power that they resolved, we hold this to be a government of white people, made and to be perpetuated for the exclusive benefit of the white race, and in accordance with the constant adjudication of the United States Supreme Court. Specifically, the infamous Dred Scott decision of 1856, where Chief Justice Roger Taney had stated explicitly that black people have no rights which the white man is bound to respect. And so you end up with a chronicle of all of the ways that white people would keep black people down and out. They were kept out of housing, thus they were kept out of neighborhoods, thus they were kept out of schools, thus they were kept out of universities. When I was a boy, there were no black students at the University of Mississippi, the University of Alabama, the University of Texas. And out of any position of equality, much less any position above others. Now, here are some developments and practices that we should know about. There were the black codes. These are in the 19th century after the Civil War. The notorious black codes were an astonishing affront to emancipation and made plain and indisputable the attempt on the part of the southern states to make Negroes slaves in everything but name. There was forced labor. The former masters had the first right to the labor, the paid labor, but they owned it and they set the pay incredibly low. They had the first right to the labor. Everybody take your pen and circle vagrancy laws. If you do any reading in history, you know that black people were perpetually being arrested for vagrancy. Well, why? There were literally only a couple of jobs they were allowed to be hired for. It was unfair. They were owned by the employer. And if they went and tried to get another job, they weren't allowed to. They set the rules that you can't have that job. And if they didn't have a job, then they were arrested for not having a job, vagrancy. And that was how it was used against black people. Let me give you a little reading assignment. Read the statements made by Curt Flood in his baseball career, near the end of his career, when he finally won the right for a baseball player to own himself. But the quotes are reminiscent of this era. Okay, I'm on page 10. Stopping the Great Migration. More than 1.5 million African Americans left the land below the Mason-Dixon line, while white Southern elites raged with cool, calculated efficiency. And so they left. And then when they ultimately tried to get more rights, there were poll taxes and literacy taxes, tests, and Jim Crow laws. When the U.S. Supreme Court first announced the 1896 decision, the states had seized on this is separate but equal. The states had seized on the separate aspect of the edict almost immediately, instituting racially distinct facilities from telephone booths to cemeteries through the 20th century. For nearly 6 decades, the same states had consistently failed to provide anything approximating equal for America's black citizens. Separate but whites were better, blacks were not equal. The voter suppression efforts. This is big. Through rules and laws and practices and poll tax and literacy tests and threats of violence. If you were a black person trying to vote, it was literally possible that the Ku Klux Klan would come and kill you in Alabama, in Mississippi. So take a look at this. In one southern state, in one southern county, 117%, I don't even know how that happens, of white people were allowed to vote and 3% of black people. In 7 counties in one state in the South, there were 0%. And here's your actual statistic. In Selma, Alabama in 1965, when John Lewis walked across the Edmund Pettus Bridge and got beaten over the head by an Alabama state trooper for the purpose of wanting the vote for black people, the percentage of black people who were legally registered to vote was 0.9%. Now the fights are on photo ID and incarcerated people when they get out not having the rights to vote. There were unequal schools. There was unequal education. In 1942, the Atlanta School Board allocated $75 more in support per capita. That was when $75 meant something for white students than for black students. The Southern Manifesto was the nickname given to laws in the Congress that fought for continuing racial division. And it turns out that practically all of the Southern members of Congress, Democrats at the time, were in favor of the Southern Manifesto. But there was one state, at least for that one brief shining moment, that did better, and a man named Lyndon Johnson voted against the Southern Manifesto. All right. There is something to white privilege. Andrew Johnson had championed the Homestead Act, which would give, not lease, 160 acres in the West to citizens who were without money, meaning poor whites, citizens. Black people were not accepted as citizens yet. When the law was finally passed, most African Americans were not citizens, and therefore, regardless of how impoverished, were ineligible. There are few heroes in this story. For example, Abraham Lincoln, who, wonderful, he signed the Emancipation Proclamation. He said, quote, "I am not, nor have ever been in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and black races." Maybe a good word for Lyndon Baines Johnson. He came out well in 2 stories. And not so good a word for Greg Abbott, who has worked diligently as Attorney General of Texas, continuing as governor to make it more difficult for African Americans to vote in Texas, having to do with photo ID laws, and this book describes that problem. So, is it black rage or white rage? Well, one would think that the rage would be among the black people, and they had every reason to be enraged. But it's the white people. That led to an epiphany. What was really at work here was white rage. And whiteness defends itself against change, against progress, against hope, against black dignity, against black lives, against reason, against truth, against facts, against native claims, and against its own laws and customs. And so at the bottom of page 10, separate but equal, it was never equal. Now, I've got just a few minutes. I want you to turn to page 2, and I really encourage you to read. There are, I think it's 85 highlighted passages from the book. I'm just got time to read a couple. Page 2, number 7. When it's bigger print or when it's bold, I did that. And boy, there's a lot I wanted to bold. The truth is that the hard-fought victories of the civil rights movement caused a reaction that stripped Brown versus Board of Education of its power, severed the jugular of the Voting Rights Act, closed off access to higher education, poured crack cocaine into the inner cities, and locked up more black men proportionately than even apartheid era South Africa. That's pretty amazing. Number 8, the truth is white rage has undermined democracy, warped the Constitution, weakened the nation's ability to compete economically, squandered billions of dollars on baseless incarceration, rendered an entire region sick, poor, woefully undereducated, and left cities nothing less than decimated. All this havoc has been wreaked simply because African Americans wanted to work, get an education, live in decent communities, raise their families, and vote. Because they were willing to take no, they were unwilling to take no for an answer. A quick comment. Reverend Michael Waters said last week that if you take the neighborhoods in Dallas where the redlining kept black people out, and then you looked at the neighborhoods where black people could buy, this is 3, 4, 5 decades ago, the black neighborhoods are poorer today, now that redlining is illegal, and the white neighborhoods are wealthier today. Fascinating. And if you look at the poverty statistics, the southern states that were most against black people coming to the same schools, the poverty is sky high. Turn to page 3, number 22. The new congressional delegations after the change after the Civil War, Reconstruction was defeated. The new congressional delegations looked hauntingly like those from the Old South. Confederate States Vice President Alexander Stephens and cabinet officers in the Confederacy, as well as 10 Confederate generals and a number of colonels, and nearly 60 Confederate Congress representatives were ready to be ensconced once again in the nation's capital. They got them back into Congress. All right, turn to page 5, a really short highlight, number 49. Ambition among black people, ambition was forbidden. And then turn to page 7. Put a mark on page 4, not page 6, don't read it now, by number 69. This is Richard Nixon and the Southern Strategy, but I'm about out of time. Turn to page 7 at number 76. Have you ever heard of the Heritage Foundation? It's a very conservative think tank. Paul Weyrich, number 76, a conservative activist, and founder of the American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC, and founder of the Heritage Foundation, was explicit early on. I don't want everybody to vote, he said, noting that the GOP's leverage in the elections quite candidly goes up as the voting populace goes down. Paul Weyrich, who founded the Heritage Foundation and founded ALEC, which writes many of the state laws. If you don't know the history of that, it's worth reading. Paul Weyrich says, we don't want many people to vote. It hurts us in the Republican Party when people vote. Amazing. Turn to page 11, and I'll end this in just a minute or two. Top of the page. Here is her hopeful fantasy ending of her book. Aim for the future. This is how we begin to diffuse the power of white rage. It is time to move into that future. It is a future where the right to vote is unfettered by discriminatory restrictions that prevent millions of American citizens from having any say in their own government. The future is one that invests in our children by making access to good schools the norm, not the exception, and certainly not dependent on zip code. The future is one that takes seriously a justice system whose enormous powers are actually used to serve and protect. The costs of the continued misuse of the criminal justice system are more than the U.S. can bear morally, politically, and financially. This is the moment now when all of us, Black, white, Latino, Native American, Asian American, must step out of the shadow of white rage, deny its power, understand its unseemly goals, and refuse to be seduced by its buzzwords, dog whistles, and sophistry. This is when we choose a different future. And I end with 5 lessons and takeaways. Number 1, Black people were not viewed as equal or capable. They were only viewed as workers for only certain kind of work and a threat in every other way. Number 2, because Black people were viewed as a threat, they had to be kept away, kept separate from workplaces, from schools, from neighborhoods. Number 3, any effort to bring opportunity for advancement to Black people was viewed as a threat. Thus, every plan and opportunity for Black advancement was rejected, fought against, and disdained. Number 4, because Black people had great difficulty advancing, lessened education opportunities, lessened job opportunities, lessened housing opportunities, among other deprivations, Black people had and have great difficulty advancing. And number 5, to fix this, there needs to be changes in laws, the providing of resources, and so much more. Well, that's the book, The White Rage, The Unspoken Truth of Our Racial Divide. I hope you found this useful. Now hold on just a second.
Everyone, can we just give a round of applause away for Randy right now? Thank you for such an amazing, compelling synopsis on the book of White Rage. I was so moved, Randy. Thank you so much for everyone coming today, including our CEO, Larry James. Larry, thank you for being on the call. Randy, again, thank you for speaking truth to power. And guys, if you want to get involved in the work that we are involved in, we are on the front lines of helping people get out of poverty. And if you would like to be a part of that mission and that today's talk resonated with your soul, please go to citysquare.org. And some people, don't have the ability to get out there and serve, especially due to COVID. You can